I am now recording this session, so if somebody misses it, they'll get a chance to see it. That also means they'll see any bits and pieces of you that might show up on the screen. So, you know, if you need to do something that's a little different, you know, just shut your computer down, turn off your video, hide that for the moment, go off and do the other thing, because there have been many Zoom bombs and Zoom fails over the last couple of months with all the Zooming that's been going on. So just note that you don't want to add to that. It's helpful if you remain muted in the background. Generally, if you have a question, a major comment, you'd like to point out something is going wrong, go ahead and unmute and let me know. I can't always see who is talking. It might take me a minute, but generally we'll remain muted till the end. I want your questions. During the bulk of the program tonight, you could just type them directly into the chat and I'll make sure to answer them. At the end, you'll have a chance you could actually talk them and ask them out loud. Yeah, if you need to step out, just go ahead and stop your video. Don't carry your laptop with you into the restroom, those kinds of things. And we will have time, plenty of time at the end for you to get your questions answered. That's really what this is about. This is not about anything more than what you want to know. So I want to make sure I answer the things you need. So I guess the next question is, who the heck? My name is Steve Kurr. I teach orchestra at Middleton High School. I've been there. This is now my 20th year. I just finished in a very weird way. I'm also the founding conductor of the Middleton Community Orchestra. Just finished my 10th season with that ensemble. Before I was a high school music teacher, I did my master's and PhD work at UW-Madison in musicology. Musicology is that snooty word for music history. And my specialties were the classic period, specifically Haydn and Beethoven. And I also did a lot of work on orchestral conducting. And then I've also been teaching a continuing ed course through the UW Division of Continuing Studies since, I think, 1997. Been doing that for a while and really enjoy helping people understand music more. So that's my gig here tonight. Let's see here. So what are we going to talk about tonight? We're going to talk about Beethoven. He's an old man this year, 250. He looks pretty good. So we know a lot about Beethoven. He's not an unknown commodity to us. He's not, who's this Beethoven fellow you're talking about? So what new things can we learn? Maybe something you haven't seen yet. What are some contexts we can put on Beethoven? And then I have a challenge for you. My challenge for you is that I want you to listen to everything by Beethoven for the next 6 months. I want you to listen as if you've never heard Beethoven before. And if you can, also you've never heard Brahms, you've never heard Wagner, you've never heard Tchaikovsky or Stravinsky, you've never heard Elvis, you've never heard rap, you've never heard the Beatles. Try to listen with fresh ears because every time I do that or I take myself back, can I remember the first time I heard Symphony No. 5 all the way through? There are things that I grasp from that experience that I might not have heard before. All right. So before we can talk about Beethoven proper, I need to set the table for him. So what was going on? What was going on in this time period when Beethoven came to Vienna? So Beethoven showed up in Vienna in the 1790s. As he's coming in, we're in the classic period, and we musicologists can't help but divide everything into chunks. So we've divided music history into 6 major time periods. We start with the Middle Ages, way back in time. The Renaissance was the 13 and 1400s. The Baroque period as we get into the 1600. Then we get into the classic period. The classic period generally goes from around 1730 to around 1800. And every single person you ask the question, When does the classic period? Will give you a different answer. So I'm just going to tell you it's about there. And in fact, there are even people who will tell you that the classic period didn't exist, and it was simply a transition between the Baroque and the Romantic, and it was a little stop on the way. Some of the things that people really enjoyed in the classic periods as composers, they wrote things with balance, structure, short phrases, and I have a couple examples here to show you. The first one, and yes, there's a picture of a nickel. Why is there a picture of a nickel on your screen? And that is because on the back of the nickel is this building, Monticello, built around the same time as we're talking about. And it's balanced and structured. You could look at this building from any of the four sides and it looks exactly the same. It's got even numbers of pillars. It's symmetrical. The construction of that building is very much the construction of the music of the time. There was balance and structure was very much on their minds. Some pieces that came right before it. We started moving into the classic period with something like this. Not short phrases. Long, drawn out phrases with lots going on. This is not classic period. That is the Baroque, and it has a lot of different kinds of structures to it. Then we get something more like this in the classic period. A short phrase, a pause after an even more. It just goes like that, and very regular construction, balanced phrase. Another example that's pretty common. Comma. Semicolon. Those kinds of things are very, very, very common in the classic period. Not all music follows that, certainly not at all. And in fact, sometimes in the classic period, taking those expectations and dashing them was a favorite hobby of the composers. And it became more and more common as we get further and further into the classic period. By the time we get to the 1790s, when Beethoven shows up on the scene, then we have people starting to really bust out of that to a degree. This is the time of Haydn, this is the time of Mozart. I also need to mention the patronage system. The main composers of the classic period were hired by aristocracy high up in the rich system of people who had lots of money, lots of land, lots of power. And they hired musicians to be their servants. And so the most important musicians of the day, Haydn was a very high up servant. He was an incredible musician, a great artist, and yet his status was servant. Mozart tried to avoid that, but couldn't, and still was a servant. The idea of running around on your own and just writing music because it was good and you wanted to, that didn't exist. You worked in the patronage system. You needed to find people who would fundraise for you and give you money to have your concerts played, or hire you to teach lessons, or write music for their staff orchestra. That was the patronage system. That started changing, of course, as we start getting into the classic period, which is also the same time as the Enlightenment, and we start seeing the aristocracy switching over more into something run by the citizens of the time. That's where Beethoven comes in. He joins us in 1792 in Vienna, in the middle of all this. I'm just going to have some music playing in the background. He moved to Vienna, actually, to study with Mozart. Mozart had heard him play a couple years earlier, and Mozart said, "Oh, watch out for this guy. He's good." not as a composer, but as a pianist, and particularly as an improviser. Beethoven was an improvising keyboard. And most of what he did was going to study keyboard and play music. He also wanted to study composition, and he wanted to study Mozart. By the time he had gotten there, but of course, you can see 1792. Mozart died in 1792. But we don't have access to Mozart anymore. And we get that right there. Is that better? So he decided to study Haydn. And what happened was that he and Haydn got along fine, but they did not see eye to eye on how to learn music. Haydn was in his 60s here. Beethoven was a whippersnapper 20-year-old, and they recognized each other's mutual talent and said, yes, you're great. This isn't going to work. So Beethoven ended up studying with a guy named Albrechtsberger, who of course is not a household name, but studied how to write fugues, how to write, all those kinds of things, and then began to compose on his own. By the time we get to 1795, we start seeing his compositions coming out. And then, as I said, musicologists, we love to break things into time periods. We've segmented Beethoven into his three periods. The early period, which is really quite classic period, reminiscent, very much based on a lot of what Haydn did, balance and structure. Then we move into his middle period, often called his heroic period, and that comes right as he's learning to deal with his deafness, of course, and that lasts for about a decade, and that is where most of his best-known works were written. And then at the end, he moves into some directions that are not what we might think of as normal, and in fact, it's sort of a branch of music that was not followed very much after his time. A more private, introspective, contemplative time period. We'll talk a little more about it later. My thought was, since we are doing this, I'll just give you a quick overview of exactly what we're talking about, what kinds of things he wrote. 9 symphonies, of course, 7 plus 2 concertos. The plus 2 means he wrote 5 piano concertos, a violin concerto, the triple concerto, and then the 2 Beethoven romances for violin and orchestra, which are concerto-like pieces, but they're not really concertos. The piano sonatas, and a host of other solo piano works, including many, many sets of variations from early in this time period. He wrote 16 quartets, a lot of other chamber music, only 1 opera, which took him forever to manage to figure out and finish. Also wrote a lot of other music for stage, including ballet music, incidental music, and music of dance. So a lot of repertoire. His opus total, his last opus numbers are 130s. And several of those earlier compositions are sets. So the opus 18 string quartets is 6 quartets. And the opus 9 string trios are 3 trios. So there's a lot of that going on. So a couple of hundred works published. Plus, then there's always the stuff that's called WOO, the Woo numbers. Those are Werk ohne Opus, works without opus number, non-published in his time. And there are 100 of those, so 300 works. So he wrote a lot of music and left us a huge legacy. Beethoven, I mean, how many pieces of Beethoven are in our standard repertoire now? He influenced so many who came after him. Brahms couldn't write a symphony because Beethoven was literally looking over his shoulder. He had a bust of Brahms in his writing area. Wagner was convinced that the only composer before his time that was worth anything was Beethoven. There's the curse of the 9, which is out there. That is that many composers couldn't complete their 9th symphony and move on to a 10th without dying. You hear about Dvorak, wrote a 9th symphony, died after the 9th symphony. Mahler wrote 9, started working on 10, then he died. The fun one is Bruckner, who wrote 8 symphonies, really didn't want to work on his ninth much because he was scared of what might happen. Worked on his ninth, finally started work. I can't finish this. Dug up an old symphony from when he was a student, called it his 0th symphony because he couldn't call it his ninth. Felt that he was out of the woods, finished his 9th symphony, and then he died. And the first major name composer after Beethoven to write a 10th symphony was Shostakovich in 1953. There were others, but big names. The Curse of the Nine was kind of entertaining. He represents a transitional period from classic to romantic. This next one, though, is really huge. Freelance composer. He wrote music without having a job. He didn't teach lessons for a famous person. He didn't have a gig at a church. He didn't work for somebody else like that. He simply would go and brown nose to people and say, hey, here's a piece I wrote for you. Wouldn't you like to pay me for another one? So this freelance idea is totally new in the compositional world and became the standard as we move into the Romantic. And then a new concept of musical legacy. Really, in a lot of ways, Beethoven is the first composer who thought of himself as a person who would be heard for years and years after his death. He knew that people 100 years after he was gone would still know the name Beethoven. And so his approach to writing was different. On your screen, you can see these sketches. This is a sketch here to the Missa Solemnis, the Madison Symphony is going to perform later in this season. And good luck to anybody who wants to decipher that. That's chicken scratchings. And yet somebody did actually decipher it on the right-hand side. That's what's there. That's what's on that page, all written up. Yeah, good luck. Good luck with that. He wrote book after book after book of sketches. You can find them online if you do a quick Google search. Just look up Beethoven sketch. You can find lots of these. There are a couple that have digitized versions. You can go just look at them and see how messy a man Beethoven really was. He did not have good penmanship. The other sketch down at the bottom is actually quite an interesting sketch. This is one of the original sketches for the famous Ode to Joy theme. Ba, 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 ba. That sounds right. Ba, 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 ba. Ba 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 ba. Not like we're used to hearing it, is it? It's a little different. He would work through for years, sometimes on pieces. The sketches for the Symphony No. 3 go back at some of them as far as 3 and 4 years. There's a fantastic recording by Leonard Bernstein where he goes through and he talks about some of the sketches for the first movement of Symphony No. 5. And then he has an orchestra play some of them. I think this sketch would go right here. And he has the orchestra play, and it sounds great. You go, wow, that's incredible. He'd say, not very good, is it? And, he'd tell you why he didn't think it was the right thing for that spot. Beethoven does engender a certain amount of hero worship. I'll just say that. All right, so in 45 minutes, there is no possible way I can tell you about everything Beethoven wrote. It's just not going to happen. So what I've chosen to do tonight is to just talk through some of the symphonies and really talk through each of the 9 symphonies and talk about some of the groundbreaking things that came from them. I could do this with any of the genres. We could do this with the string quartets. We could do this with the piano sonatas. We could do them with concertos. But I chose symphony because this is the Madison Symphony Orchestra League, after all. So I figured that would be our best bet. A couple of notes as we're going. I'm using, for some of my information, a book I don't think you'll be able to see it. Yeah, maybe you can. It's called the Beethoven Compendium by a guy named Barry Cooper. You can still find it on Amazon and Barnes and Noble. You can find them on eBay. I got my copy actually at Half Price Books. So they show up. And Barry Cooper, one of the top Beethoven scholars, and in fact was the guy who about 20, 30 years ago realized the orchestral sketches for the 10th Symphony of Beethoven and had them performed. So Beethoven / Cooper is the Symphony number 10. So we're going to go through each of the 10 symphony, now we're going to stick with just 9, and talk about each of these with just a little bit of what was really groundbreaking. What did Beethoven do that pushed envelopes and made things change? These will not play while I'm talking, I promise. So we're going to start with Symphony number 1. Symphony number 1 is a C major symphony. It is dedicated to Baron von Swieten. Von Swieten shows up as a character in the movie Amadeus. He's one of the bigwigs, literally bigwigs, who shows up in there talking to Mozart. This is his Opus 21. It was written in published in 1801, but some parts of it actually are as early as 1795. What is groundbreaking about this, almost the entire symphony is very, very much like you might expect from Haydn or Mozart of this time period, except the third movement. The third movement is titled Minuet, which is, boy, that's what every third movement of a symphony by Mozart and Haydn is titled. But here is that minuet. Oops. So a minuet is a stately dance. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Very, cordial and regal to a degree. That was not. That was fast. That was kind of raucous. That was what Haydn actually had in a couple of his quartets, known as a scherzo, which comes from the word joke. It was humorous and fun and entertaining. And this scherzo, it's called a minuet, but it really is a scherzo. And Beethoven was one of the first people to use a scherzo in a symphony. He was not the first, but he certainly, this is unusual at the time. Minuets, yes. Scherzo, no. He knew that was a problem. That's why he called it a minuet. So he's trying to get away with that. The second symphony, we'll also talk about that dance movement. This is a D major symphony. It was dedicated to Prince Lichnowsky. It is his Opus 36 from 1802. He is finishing this up just about the time that he is writing that thing called the Heiligenstadt Testament, which is the letter to his brothers where he says, I'm going deaf. If it weren't for my music, I would kill myself. This is titled Scherzo. It's still very balanced, like a classic period. It still has those nice even phrase lengths and little repeat signs in there. It certainly is very, very much that way, but it is titled Scherzo. He said, yeah, Symphony number 1, I called it a minuet, but it was really a scherzo. This time, I'm just going to call it a scherzo like it is. There are some other things in the Second Symphony that are quite groundbreaking. His use of harmonies and how he gets from one harmony to another are quite new in this symphony. But for me to explain that in a Zoom format, it's not going to be really easy. There is more than just that in that symphony. Symphony number 3, the Eroica Symphony. We are maybe more familiar with this one than some of the others we've heard so far. E flat major, originally dedicated to Napoleon. Then Napoleon called himself emperor, and Beethoven scratched out the dedication and said, no, no, no. Now it's dedicated to the memory of a great man. This is his Opus 55. It was written between 1802 and 1804. All the while he's sketching this, he's also sketching his Prometheus ballet. So there's a lot of connection between these pieces. And there is a lot of research that says that the storyline that in his mind was happening was also this Prometheus storyline. It is new in so many ways. First of all, Symphony number 1, Symphony number 2, 25, 30 minutes when you play all the repeats. The Third Symphony, 55 minutes. Considerably longer. The type of power he's trying to achieve, unusual. The finale with its unusual set of variations, that's to end a symphony with variations, that is pretty much unheard of at the time. It is a signifier that Beethoven is moving the importance of the symphony from the first movement to the finale. When you look at a Haydn symphony, a Mozart symphony, the first movement is where the meat happens. That first movement is longer than the others. It's got more intensity to it. And in some cases, in some symphonies of the earlier classic period, the first movement is the length of the others combined. And in this movement, this symphony is not that way. He is pushing it and making so that you're going to want to listen all the way through because the entire thing has important moments. The spot I'm going to play for you, however, is not the finale. I want to play for you a thing that's called Tovey's Cloud. Tovey's Cloud. I'll tell you more about it in a minute. Here's the opening of the symphony. Okay, the opening of the symphony opens with those two big, powerful chords. Those are called the premier coup d'archet, the opening stroke of the bow. And then you get ba da 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 da. That note right there, that's a C sharp. A C sharp is called Tovey's Cloud. In the late 1800s, a musicologist by the name of Tovey said that moving to this C sharp sets a cloud over this symphony that is not resolved until the end of the finale. So really, for the first time, a composer is taking and setting himself up a challenge and say, well, okay, now how am I going to get out of that? And spends, in this case, 55 minutes figuring out how to undo what he just did. I'll give you the quick and dirty on why that's a cloud. Key of E flat major. The C he plays, that cloud, the C sharp resolves to D. D in the key of E flat is a weird note. He's basically it would be as if you went on vacation and you were driving from Madison and you were going to go from Madison to Chicago, and you decided to drive to Madison to Chicago by way of Des Moines. You're immediately going someplace completely out of the way to get where you were going. In the Second Symphony, he would have driven to Chicago by going down through Chicago. He might have taken Interstate 88 over and hit the south side of Chicago. But Symphony number 3, he goes to Des Moines right off the bat. It's just a completely different approach to composing. How do you compose a symphony? You set yourself a challenge and then you fix it. Symphony number 4. I'll tell you that Symphony number 4 gets a lot of overlooking as compared to the others, because here's 3, Titanic Eroica Symphony. Here's 5, what can you say? And then there's 4 in between. Oh, poor little 4. the sort of the ugly stepsister of the symphonies, but it's actually quite impressive. It's in B flat major. It was dedicated to Count Oppersdorf. You see all these counts that he's dedicating these all to. He's hoping they'll pay him for this. It's his Opus 60. It's from 1806. Even Schumann said, it's a slender Greek maiden in between two huge Nordic giants. What are you going to do against that? But what's really new is that it's fully fledged in the Romantic. Here's the spot I want to play for you. That's the opening of the Scherzo movement from Symphony No. 4. We heard a little bit of Symphony No. 1 and 2 and their Scherzo movements. No. 4's has different phrase lengths. No. 4's has different harmonic progressions. No. 4's is quite fast, and the accents are not on the main beats. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, da, 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 da. He's using this new approach to metrics to propel this symphony. We don't think of it that way because we are comparing it to 3 and 4, or 3 and 5. But if you take out of your mind, I've never heard 5, I've never heard 6 and 7 or 8 or 9. 4 is got a lot to it that is groundbreaking. No. 5, C minor, dedicated to Lobkowitz and Razumovsky, the same guy that he dedicated the string quartets to. Hits his Opus 67. He worked on it in 1807 and 1808. It is his first minor key symphony. Its finale is now critically important. As famous as those opening 4 notes are, the finale is where he was headed the entire time. So it is an organic work, organic construction. In the classic period, if you listen to Mozart's Symphony No. 14, it's a nice symphony. But if somebody came by and pulled the second movement out of that symphony and put another one of similar key into it, you probably would never know. That's okay. They weren't really connected. The music in the second movement wasn't necessarily related to the first or the third or the fourth. Here in Symphony No. 5 by Beethoven, it is organically connected. It is impossible for you to really to switch out and trade out a movement without seriously damaging the motion from the beginning to the end. Each of the 4 movements contains a little bit of that ba-ba-ba-ba, ba-ba-ba-ba theme. They're all ripe with it. This symphony is completely connected. Another term that's used for that is cyclic writing. It's a cyclic symphony. If you want a really interesting, I'll play a little bit here. Hang on. There's that theme. So that comes in twice. He does the third movement. It's directly connected to the fourth movement. You know, winds up, gets into it, plays a ways in the fourth movement, and then says, nope, nope, we're going to do that again. Backs up into the third movement and gets a running start and goes into the fourth movement again. That structure has never been seen earlier than the Fifth Symphony, showing the power of that arrival of the finale. The finale is super important. A really great study of what is new and important in this symphony is actually done by Peter Schickele. Peter Schickele, the PDQ Bach guy. If you listen to his New Horizons in Music Appreciation, it's a comic thing. It is a sports cast of the Fifth Symphony First Movement. And they're off with a 4-note theme. Oh, it's very exciting. Not a cloud in the sea, all this kind of thing. It's very entertaining. But in throughout, Schickele mentions many of the things that make that first movement super different from what had come before. Symphony number 6. This is the programmatic symphony, the pastoral. It's F major, dedicated to Lobkowitz and Razumovsky, the same as number 5, because they were performed at the same concert. Actually, 5 and 6 were completed in a different order. He completed number 6 first, but he started working on number 5 first. So that's why he called that number 5. The performance, actually, where these were premiered in 1808, contained these 2 symphonies, the 4th piano concerto, and the choral fantasy, all thrown into one concert with a whole bunch of Beethoven improvisation in between. I would love to be at that concert. Build me a time machine, send me there, please. The symphony number 6 is programmatic, which is unusual in symphonic works, but not unheard of. It had been done before. It's 5 movements. The last 3 are all connected. That's unusual. Here's a bit of The Thunderstorm. So, programmatic symphonies, yeah, that's been done before. We had Vivaldi doing programmatic concertos in the classic period, or the Baroque period. We had Haydn do a couple of programmatic type of things. We had a guy named Dittersdorf did a bunch of symphonies based on Ovid, but they didn't have the orchestra that Beethoven had access to. They didn't have the structures that he had access to. So this symphony with program is a new version of programmatic music. It's bigger and bolder than had been done before. And it's not matched again until we get to Berlioz in 1830 in his Symphonie Fantastique. Symphony number 7 is a sunny key of A major. It's dedicated to Count Fries. It's his Opus 92, and it's from a couple years later, 1811, 1812. It is an expression of personal message rather than of compositional technique. He's not going about number 7 to show off. He's going about number 7 because he loved it. And strange that it's so happy. People always, well, he's deaf by then. Why is he so happy? Because he's a happy person generally, even though he's always portrayed as being grumpy. This was a good time in his life. He loved this piece. It is referred to as the apotheosis of the dance. Lots of dance movements, but not everybody liked it. Here's a bit from the end of the first movement of the symphony. There's this drone pattern. Ostinato in the low strings. not everybody enjoyed that. Carl Maria von Weber said he was ripe for the madhouse for writing that. But it's a different kind of approach to things. The way he's put that together with the movement from positions of harmonic instability to positions of stability are gone about in a new way in this symphony. It is very dance filled. The first movement is da 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 da, da of Scotch dance. The third movement is a lilting scherzo. It's the second movement, of course, is the pavan, pa ta ta ta. So it's very much a dance symphony. Number 8 in F major. No dedication to this one. 1812, it's his opus 93. Schumann called it of profound humor. And it really is, it's at this point when we're clear that we are firmly in the Romantic period. And yet, he finds ways to bring back cute little things. This is the second movement. This movement was composed as he became familiar with a new device by a guy named Maelzel. Maelzel invented this little gizmo that goes tick-tock, tick-tock, tick-tock. It's a metronome. And Beethoven loved it. He said, this is fantastic, and wrote this movement as a sort of an homage to this new gizmo. He then went back to all his symphonies and wrote in metronome markings post having composed them. He went back to all of the symphonies, every movement, and put metronome markings in. Some conductors will now go through and try to match those. It is actually quite possible that the metronome that he was using was wrong, because some of the symphonies are too fast, almost unplayable, including the final movement of number 8, which is, if you play it at the metronome marking that Beethoven puts on there, it's only possible if you've had a lot of caffeine. It's very fast for the string players. And then, of course, the groundbreaking things in Symphony number 9 are well documented. It's D minor, dedicated to King Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia. It's his opus 125 and doesn't come until 1823-24. So more than a decade after his 8th symphony, he's been doing other things. He's into his final period. He's been writing string quartets. He's been working on piano sonatas. He's been working on trying to take care of his nephew. It opens with an unusual sort of introduction. It's at the correct tempo, but doesn't seem to have any theme to it. And of course, then the final movement is got a choir. Here's the opening. Coming through the sky. And I'm not even going to get to the 9th movement, where he takes a simple theme, that Ode to Joy theme, and builds a 20-minute movement based on it with a double fugue and chorus and all sorts of incredible things that are not in normal symphonies up to this point. The vocal recitatives preceded by instrumental recitatives, so much new in all of these pieces. So what are we going to expect? We weren't going to expect that. What are we going to expect this year? You're hoping to see a lot of performances by orchestras and so forth, and pianists and string quartets of Beethoven, with with the way we're working right now on quarantine, I don't know how many we'll get to hear. And that's Beethoven's getting gypped out of his big birthday year. Right now, Madison Symphony is scheduled to perform 7 works throughout this coming season, all throughout. Other groups are doing the same. We're going to be hearing from the Middleton Community Orchestra, the Wisconsin Chamber Orchestra, string quartets in town are going to be doing Beethoven. Clearly, some of the international and national orchestras are doing similar things. There are a series of new recordings coming out. Deutsche Grammophon and Naxos have complete sets coming out. You can find them on Amazon or on the websites for these companies. And there are several new books on the horizon. Swafford, Padel, Duesenberg. There's some new things coming out. If you want to learn more about Beethoven and his birthday year, it's a great time to do that. So what I have now for you is a chance for you to ask your questions. If you have a question, you can unmute and ask. If you're more comfortable to do so, please type it into the chat. I'll answer anything you've got. You've got a musicologist on staff ready to help you out with anything you'd like to know. It's all yours.
Mr. Kurr, this is Beth Rocco. I want to thank you for taking over the beginning of this meeting. I tried to tell a few people the 4 o'clock invitation that was sent by the MSO office had the wrong address. And Steve and I figured it out at 6:45, so I stayed in that meeting, and Steve then conducted everything on his own. So I thank him profusely for doing that. And I trust that he introduced himself and you enjoy the beginning of this program so much. Steve is just an amazing instructor from Middleton High School. He's loved, and Linda Lovejoy brought him to my attention because she had the music appreciation for 8 years. So I don't know, Steve, if you covered Beethoven's life, his home life in the beginning. If you didn't, would you dwell on that a little bit?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Beethoven did not have a really fun childhood. It was a family of musicians where he was born in Bonn. He was very accomplished at an early age. By the age of 12, he could play piano, he could play viola, he could play organ. And he was quite good on all those, particularly on piano. He, like I mentioned earlier, he came to, in 1786, came to Vienna on a tour and played for Mozart. Mozart said, keep your eyes on him. He's going to, someday the world will talk about him. Someday the world will give him something to give something. But his mother died and his dad became an alcoholic. By the time he was 18, he was the guardian of his younger brothers. And that was actually a theme that would play out through a lot of his life. I mentioned that when he was writing the 7th and 8th symphonies, they're both very happy. And those are very happy times in his life because while he has the deaf issue, he's accepted it and moved on. And at this point, he's actually working to help support his nephew Carl. He's working on, helping out his brothers. So it's actually a positive time in his life. His family was important to him, even though his teen years were not the best. There, of course, is all the speculation that his father beat him and he, boxed his ears, they say, and caused some of his deafness, that he had a childhood disease that was not cared for. There's lots of apocryphal stories about how his childhood went. And I would recommend that you find one of those books, the Barry Cooper book I mentioned earlier, or I'll have a sheet here in a little bit with some books that could spend more time on that early part of his life, just to give you a different context of where he's at personally by the time he comes to Vienna. What other questions might you have tonight? one of the things I will tell you is that I'm going to give you my email, and you're welcome to use that if you have questions later.
Did the orchestra grow in size under Beethoven?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and the answer is it does. It is partly from him, and partly it's just getting larger in general. So under early Haydn, you maybe would have 4, 6 violins in each section, cellos, violas. You know, you've got a string section of 20, and then a pair of oboes and a pair of horns. That was the entire orchestra. As Haydn gets further into his career, you get a slightly larger string section. You're going to start adding a single flute and then a pair of flutes. You start adding a pair of clarinets. The bassoon was actually almost always there, but almost always early on in Haydn and Mozart played the cello part. And the bassoon started getting its own things and becoming then required. 2 horns started growing into 4. We started adding occasionally trumpets and timpani. And even in early symphonies by Beethoven, the first and the second, that's about what you have. And the timpani and the trumpet players are just playing bum, 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 bum. They don't have anything really engaging. By the time we get to the third symphony, that's changed. And by the time we get to that time, the string section's a little larger. We've added other instruments in. By the time we get to the fifth symphony, we add a piccolo, trombone trio, and contrabassoon. So he's adding more instruments to that. You also get the contrabassoon in the Ninth Symphony. So yes, absolutely. From the time Beethoven starts to the time Beethoven ends, he is involved with writing music for larger ensembles, and so are others. By the time he's 1827, 3 years later, we get the Berlioz Symphony Fantastique with all sorts of things in it. The orchestra has really grown. Yeah, good question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any others?
You mentioned that they did not care much for his Seventh Symphony, but with all the new differences that he did, was he accepted overall? Was he a sensation from the beginning? Or did he have a lot of people that did not like his new changes?
Well, all right, so that's a difficult question in some ways, because while some people didn't like his Seventh Symphony, the truth is that the audiences loved it from the start. That second movement, that Pavane movement, was the audience at the first performance required it to be played 2 more times before you could move on to the next movement. So they absolutely, from the very get-go, that symphony was a great hit. There's the stories about him conducting one of his premieres and not knowing that the audience was clapping for him and giving him a standing ovation, and one of the musicians standing him up and turning him around so he could see the audience giving him great accolades. He was not necessarily the easiest person to spend time with, but his music was generally loved from the start. There are exceptions to that. There are definitely exceptions, and there's Beethoven that's not as good. And I don't want to denigrate any of your favorite pieces. There are a few I would say fit into he needed to get that done for a commission, and it's probably not as inspired as some of his other works. And yet he was asked for commission after commission. What really gave him grief was how people didn't really care for his opera. He really wanted to write opera. He wanted to write a great opera, and he had so many problems getting that off the ground. 4 overtures. So a lot of difference with that. So yeah, I would say that I wouldn't call it a mixed bag. I would say that most people really enjoyed his music, and there were some detractors. Anything else? I'm going to tell you, I have a parting gift for you. It's a PDF handout if you have access to a QR code reader on a cellular device, you could click there. I also am sending the document as a PDF to the MSOL office tonight after we're done, and they'll attach it for those of you who are here. On this document, it has a couple of things, a list of the Madison Symphony Orchestra performance pieces this year, a quick breakdown of his 3 time periods and some of the major works from those time periods, and a couple of internet links for you, leading you to some articles that have been written in the last year from New York Times, from the Beethoven House in Bonn, from some other major names, and some links of a couple of those books I talked about at the beginning, so that if you want to do a little further investigation on your own, you could certainly do that. And then here's my email if you'd like to just send me drop me a note and ask me a question. I'm always happy to answer. Music is one of my very, very favorite things on the entire planet, and one of the best things to do about music is to discuss it. So I like to talk about music a lot. We used to have a group of musicology grad students who would get together and sample each other's recordings for 3 or 4 hours, sipping various beverages. And one of our favorite things was to try to see if we could name all the Beethoven opus numbers in a row. All right, opus 1, what is it? It's, what keys now? Opus 2, what is it? It's trio sonata. Opus, try to go through and name them all. That's how we stayed sharp in musicology grad school days. And it's also fun for those of us who didn't have anything else to do on a Saturday night. So the last slide for you tonight is to let you know that we're going to try this again in a couple weeks. On Monday the 29th, we're going to do a little bit about humor and classical music, going all the way back to the Middle Ages and finding some things all the way through up until some of the more modern classical music parodists that exist today. It'll be the same Zoom format. And then finally, either this scan link if you have capability, or I'll send out the link in with the PDF I'm sending out. Madison Symphony Orchestra League would like you to fill out a survey, just a really short, it's 4 questions, should take you just a couple of moments to fill it out, just to give them a little feedback on this presentation and the general concept of this program. I know that we all wanted to be doing opera in the park and things like that out in the summer, and we know that that's not going to be completely available, so they're finding ways to keep you connected. So this link is available. I would recommend against writing it down by hand, but you could take a picture of it, you could scan that, and like I say, it'll be on the PDF in the email. So I think that is my final slide. So I'm really excited to have had you here tonight. I hope you had a good time. I hope to see you in a couple of weeks. If anybody has any other questions, I'm happy to hang around and answer anything else. But at this point, I bid you have a great evening, and enjoy the weather that's out there. The next couple of days are going to be a little warm. But I hope to see you in 2 weeks. Thanks for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. One of the things that I was going to say in the beginning is today would have been the actual concert on the green. We would have been at Bishop's Bay and had the entire day of golf and a full symphony orchestra under the tent. And a year that we had no rain, so that would have been a beautiful day. And I know that's where everyone's heart would have been today. So I thank Mr. Kurr for doing this for us, and again for 2 weeks from now, humor and classical music I think will be a lot of fun. The survey just has how can we improve, what would you like to see in other events, and really just 4 simple questions. If you can't find it tonight, we will try to send it out tomorrow or the next few days with the new invitation. It will come across as an email blast to all 380 members of the Symphony league. And then the link that Mr. Kurr is going to put on Google will be for anyone to enjoy the YouTube link of these recorded events. So thank you so very much for coming. And if you want to talk to Steve for a little bit longer, please do. But I appreciate so much all of you to stay connected with the MSOL. And we really look forward to seeing you again. Stay well.
Have a great night.
Thank you.